Sergeant Mara Hill arrived at Black Ridge Training Base with a calm stride, her boots hitting the ground in a steady rhythm that didn't match the tense energy of the place. Everyone who came here either broke, toughened up, or learned to fear one man more than enemy fire: Colonel Briggs. His presence was a shadow over the entire base, tall, loud, and convinced that humiliation was the sharpest tool of leadership. New recruits whispered about him before they ever saw him, and old recruits stood straighter whenever his voice echoed across the yard. Mara stood in the morning lineup, eyes forward, shoulders relaxed, her breath steady, even as Colonel Briggs approached. His boots stopped right in front of her, closer than necessary. He looked her up and down with the slow, practiced cruelty of a man who loved finding weakness. The line of soldiers stiffened, waiting for the explosion they knew was coming. "You!" he barked, tapping her name patch with 2 fingers. "Hill, right? You think you belong here?" Mara didn't flinch, didn't blink. "Yes, sir." Her voice was calm, almost gentle, and that irritated him even more. He circled around her like a predator that had found a new target. "I've read your file. Nothing impressive. Civilian background, no connections, no history worth noting, and you show up here acting like you're better than my men." She hadn't done anything of the sort, but the colonel didn't need a reason. He wanted a victim. Then, in a move so deliberate the whole unit held its breath, he grabbed her backpack and dumped it onto the ground. Everything spilled out. Neatly folded clothes, a few personal items, her field notebook, all scattered like debris. A few soldiers shifted uncomfortably, but none dared move. "Pick it up," he said, voice low and threatening. "And next time you step in my base, remember your place." Mara crouched, gathering her things one by one, but her expression didn't twist into shame like he wanted. Her eyes remained cold, quiet, steady, not defeated, calculating. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the colonel's face. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't broken. And in that small, silent moment, before any of them understood it, the war between them began. The whispers started almost immediately after the humiliation on the training yard. Recruits who had seen dozens of soldiers break under Colonel Briggs's voice found themselves glancing at Mara Hill with a strange mix of curiosity and confusion. No one had ever stood so calm under his cruelty. No one had looked him in the eyes with that cold, measured silence. Something about her didn't fit the image of a simple new recruit. Mara didn't talk much, but her actions spoke louder than gossip ever could. During morning runs, she didn't just finish first. She finished so far ahead she had time to rest before the next person arrived. In combat drills, her movements were sharp and efficient, like someone who had already learned these lessons long ago. Even the instructors, hardened men who rarely praised anyone, exchanged looks when she dismantled a full sparring opponent with flawless technique. Colonel Briggs watched all of it with growing irritation. He had intended to embarrass her once and move on, but instead, she had become a spotlight he couldn't ignore. Her quiet confidence gnawed at him, reminding him of someone, or rather, some unit he desperately wanted to forget. Years ago, Briggs had tangled with a covert tactical group known as Shadowline, a special operations outfit that operated underground, answering to agencies far above his rank. There had been an incident, one that Briggs had covered up, lied about, and buried with everything he had. And Mara Hill, without revealing it to anyone, had once been part of that very unit. Though no one at the base knew her past, Briggs recognized pieces of it in her stance, her precision, the way she scanned a room without moving her head. Each day, her presence dug deeper into his old fear, the fear of someone who had survived what he tried to erase. So he decided to crush her before she became a problem. He pushed her harder than anyone else, giving her impossible tasks, extending her training hours, assigning her the dirtiest, most punishing chores. He expected to see cracks, exhaustion, anger, anything. But Mara met every challenge with quiet endurance, her expression unreadable. She wasn't fighting him out of pride. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was gathering information, waiting, watching his pattern, because she knew that, eventually, Colonel Briggs would cross a line, and when he did, she would be ready. Night fell over Black Ridge like a thick curtain, swallowing the base in cold shadows. It was supposed to be a standard night exercise. Navigation, stealth movement, tactical decision-making. But the moment Mara stepped into the forested training zone, she felt the wrongness in the air. The silence was too still, the darkness too heavy. The terrain markers slightly shifted from where they should have been. Someone had tampered with everything, and she already knew who. Colonel Briggs had been watching her all week with a growing hatred, as if she were a reminder of a failure he thought he had left buried years ago. Tonight, he wanted her broken, humiliated, eliminated from the base through incompetence. So he had turned a simple training drill into a trap. The first sign came when she found her communicator damaged, wires exposed, deliberately cut. A second sign followed moments later, bootprints too deep, belonging to men heavier than any recruit. Not trainees, professionals. He had sent his elite enforcers, soldiers loyal enough to follow his off-the-record orders. Mara's heartbeat remained steady. She didn't panic. She simply inhaled once, deeply, letting her senses open the way her Shadowline instructors had drilled into her years ago. Every sound, every faint vibration in the ground, every shift of leaves became a map in her mind. Then the ambush began. A flash grenade arced through the air. She dropped before it detonated, rolling behind a tree as three silhouettes charged. Their movements were sharp, coordinated, meant for capture, not training. Mara used their confidence against them, knocking one out with a palm strike to the throat, using his falling body as a shield against the second, and sweeping the third's legs before any of them understood they were outmatched. But she wasn't just fighting, she was recording. Hidden inside her jacket, a small body camera blinked silently, capturing every illegal move Briggs had orchestrated. More attackers came, more traps sprung, but everyone collapsed under her precision. She disabled equipment, disarmed men twice her size, and moved through the forest like someone who had survived much worse than this. By the time she reached the extraction point, 8 elite soldiers were on the ground behind her, groaning, unconscious, or bound with their own restraints. Colonel Briggs was waiting there, red-faced and furious, convinced she had cheated, that she had embarrassed him intentionally. He stepped too close, grabbed her arm too hard, hissed threats into her face. He didn't know the cameras above them were rolling, and he didn't know Mara had just collected the final piece of evidence needed to destroy him. The next morning, the base felt different, like a storm brewing behind the calm sky. Soldiers whispered in tight circles, instructors moved tensely, and Colonel Briggs stalked across the grounds with a simmering rage that hadn't cooled since the failed ambush. He expected Mara to appear shaken, bruised, maybe even begging for protection after the exercise. Instead, she walked into the training yard with steady steps and a cold focus that made even seasoned soldiers tense. She didn't confront him. She didn't shout. She didn't seek revenge through violence. Mara went straight to the military tribunal office. Inside a quiet room filled with senior officers, she placed her body cam recordings, drone footage from the exercise zone, time-stamped logs, and the audio of the colonel's threats onto the table. The officers watched in stunned silence as the truth unfolded. The sabotage, the illegal deployment of elite soldiers outside mission protocol, the physical intimidation, the verbal abuse. Everything Briggs had kept hidden for years was suddenly on full display, undeniable and brutal. Her voice was calm but powerful as she made her statement. She detailed the colonel's history of misconduct, the pattern of humiliation, the psychological abuse of recruits, and the deliberate attempts to break soldiers under the guise of discipline. She also provided testimonies from Shadowline contacts who had been waiting for the chance to expose him. Mara didn't attack him with fists. She attacked him with truth, sharpened into a blade. Within an hour, the tribunal ordered a temporary suspension of Briggs' authority pending investigation. The colonel, blind with fury, stormed out of his office and marched toward the training ground, fully intent on confronting her again, maybe even forcing a confession. But the moment he grabbed Mara's arm in front of the assembled soldiers, something happened he didn't expect. The unit stepped forward, 1 soldier, then 3, then the entire line moved between them. Men and women who had once trembled under his voice now stood firm, eyes burning with anger and loyalty to Mara, the woman who had finally given them the courage to speak. They had seen the footage. They had heard the threats. They weren't going to let him touch her again. Colonel Briggs stood frozen, realizing too late that his power was gone. Not because someone fought him, but because someone revealed who he truly was. and Mara watched him with the same steady silence that had terrified him from the start. The hearing room felt colder than any training yard, a place where uniforms didn't make you powerful, truth did. Colonel Briggs sat at the far end of the long metal table, stripped of his usual confidence, his shoulders stiff, his jaw locked in a desperate clench. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one giving orders. He was the one being judged. Mara entered quietly, the same way she did everything, without theatrics, without ego, without fear. But something about her presence made the officers straighten in their seats. She carried no weapons, no armor, no rank that rivaled a colonel's, yet she held more weight in that moment than he ever had. The tribunal began. Evidence played on large screens. The ambush, the threats, the illegal tactics, the humiliation. Briggs' voice echoed through the room, cold and cruel, exposing the side he'd hidden behind medals and authority. One officer put his hand over his mouth in disbelief. Another shook his head slowly, as if finally seeing the monster behind the uniform. When it was Mara's turn to speak, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't attack him personally. She simply described what everyone already knew but had been too afraid to admit. How fear had become the base's culture. How recruits were shaped by abuse instead of discipline. How too many promising soldiers had crumbled under a man who mistook authority for ownership. But the most powerful moment came when she said 4 simple words. "He can't break me." The room went silent. Even Briggs, who had been muttering to his lawyer, lifted his head. In that single line, Mara took away the last power he ever held. One by one, witnesses came forward. Instructors, medics, even veterans the colonel had dismissed years before. Her courage unlocked their voices. Their testimonies filled the record like wounds finally exposed to air. When the verdict arrived, it was swift and unforgiving. Colonel Briggs was stripped of command, demoted, and placed under arrest for misconduct, abuse of power, and endangerment of soldiers. The guards led him out in handcuffs. Not a single soldier saluted him. Not one looked away in pity. Outside, the base gathered in the open yard. When Mara stepped through the doors, the wind carrying her hair across her face, the entire formation straightened. Not out of fear, but out of respect that came from the soul. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply breathed in the quiet air of a place finally free. And as soldiers raised their hands in salute, one truth settled across the base like sunlight after a long storm. Mara Hill didn't just survive the colonel. She ended the reign of a tyrant and rebuilt the meaning of strength.